answer sheet then.
Which questions do we want to see? Do we go over questions? I see mostly 4s and 5s, and then more 1s than else. And all of these can be done in desmos. So starting with number 1, we need to write an equation that goes through these 2 points. So if I were to type in these 2 points, I know I need an equation, so that's going to give me my equation of a line, y equals mx plus b. So I'm going to type that in. And I'm going to add in all my sliders. I'm going to count the slope between the 2 points, which is going up 2 over 1, so 2. Change this slope to b2. And then move the b until it goes through those 2 points. It's supposed to be a negative. So then your equation would be y equals 2x minus 3 or b. If you're using decimals, make sure you're putting something about using decimals. Have any questions? Number 4. If I have an equation, so I'm going to type in the whole thing first and see what happens. And nothing appears. So that tells me one of 2 things. It's either infinitely many or no solution. Because if it was x equals 0, I have a line at 0. If it was x equals -5, I have a line. It's not A or B. To determine that, I'm going to get rid of half of this and put it in another line. And they ended up overlapping, so that was infinitely many. If they were 2 separate lines with the same slope, they would have been parallel lines and no solution. So if you solved it and you got 0 equals 0 or the same number equals the same number on both sides, that's infinitely many. They'd be 2 different numbers. Right, and then number 5. So there's one that's an obvious choice. B and then C, and then number 5. The obvious choice is one that matches this. This is a solid line, so it can't be A or B. It's shaded above, so it has to be B. The slope is 1, it's starting at 3. And then you can look at E or F to see which of those 2 also match. Either by solving it or putting it in desmos. If you put this into desmos, you would see that it's this thing. Starts at 3, slope of 1, solid line shaded above. So B and F for your final answers to that. If you chose the work that slide, if not, make sure you use this. If you use that, so that you said that. Questions on that? from now up until the SOL, besides when we go over the tenth tab on Monday and the start check on Tuesday, we're gonna be going through this packet, whatever questions you guys wanna go through. So if there's something maybe you're struggling with, how do I solve this? How do I do it in Desmo? These are like last minute. If you forget how to do it, how can I use Desmos to help me solve it? So we can start on whatever page you guys want. You guys look through that packet. There are handwritten notes in there on the different Desmos hacks, how you can use them. We're just gonna go through different examples. And everyone should have an iPhone to be using Desmos as we don't have an iPad program. So we can start with A1, you can skip around, whatever questions you guys want to see, do go through. You guys let me know. So I would say start with telling me what the section is called, and then we can find how much step. So we'll start with that one. I'm going to use the Desmos hack first, and then if we want to see it by hand, we'll do that afterwards. So, and this is written already in yours. I don't have mine up here, but so to use the Desmos hack on anything laws of exponents using your exponent rule, we're going to type in the original. Go ahead and do that in Desmos. You can use this A and B, and C, sorry. Just because. It's harder to do on the board. Six to the seventh, b to the b squared, c to the third. I'm gonna add in all the sliders and just change them to different values. Something that's not 1 or 0, I would say leave them positive. That way you don't have to worry about any negatives or anything like that. And then I'm gonna put in each answer choice. So go ahead and start doing that.
So we're gonna be the same. Square. See together. 7. 7 squared, no b squared 2 -2
So then, once I have in all my answer choices, I have in my sliders, I have in my original. I can see my original gave me -2.4, and I just look for the one that matters. That works for all of your multiple choice, but it also works if it's not multiple choice. Let's say you have to just type in your final answer. You could put in your original, put in your final, and see if the decimals match. If you wanted to just do it by hand, all of your exponent rules are given in the product rule, power rule, those. So using those rules, you would divide the two numbers, dividing them both by 3. You would subtract the exponents. I'm just gonna write what it is first. B to the 0 would just become 1, and then you would end up with. And you would put that together in one big fraction. Questions there on Desmos by hand? What other questions do you have? What number? It's the number 8, the radical operation. So on the SOL A3 page, the simplifying radicals, sorry, the radical operation for number 8. Anything with just numbers and radicals, if you're using Desmos, you could put that straight into Desmos. I'm gonna put in the original, exactly as it's given, 2 times the square root of 7. And 3 times the square root of 28. It's gonna give me a number. And then 1, because it gave me a whole number, I see that the answer is. But if it gave me a decimal, I would put in all of the answer choices to see if the decimal match. So in this case, I don't have to do anything else. 84 is the answer B. Want to see this algebraically? Did anyone else want to see this algebraically? Do that really quick. And remember that you can do all of these algebraically, but while you have desmos, double check. So algebraically for number 8, you would multiply 2 and 3 together and 7 and 28 together. Those. (196) happens to be a perfect square. So the square root of 196. And you could do that in desmos too. It would be 14. And then you would multiply 16. Which number did you say? On the same page. Writing down which ones we're doing, that way we don't go back and do it again. Okay, number 2, you can use the Desmos slider pack, but because you have X and Y, you need to capitalize the X's, the X and Y's. To get your cube root, you can do one of two things, either type in the letter CBRT or go into functions, go all the way down and hit the N. Either or, it doesn't matter. You could also type in square root the same way. Go ahead and type in your original, and then you're going to start to type in your final answer. Make sure your X and Y are capitalized, add in all your sliders. If it's a cube root, it doesn't matter if it's negative or positive. I had a thought as I was saying that. If it's a square root, definitely don't make it negative because you won't get a real answer. But if it's a cube root, I would say just still stay with the positive because you might change it to a negative, but it really doesn't matter. Just to show that, I'll make one negative. And then I'll type in these answers. Make sure each answer has a capital variable. That's definitely not the answer. Also not. We bump them and have to do. That's the only one that matters. But then our answer was. Anyone want to see that one done by hand? What other questions do we have? Do that one more time. See, number 6, the same page. So this is another one, we can just check the decimals, see if they match. So I'm gonna type in this into Desmos. So 3 times the square root of 45. And then outside of that minus the square root of 20. I get some decimal. And then I'm just gonna start putting in the answer choices to see which one matches. Not A. Not B. Not C, so then it has to be D. That is the decimal point. Anyone want to see that one done? What other questions do we have?
Oh, no.
The quadratics. One. 8.4b quadratics. So anytime it asks you to find the roots or solutions or x-intercepts or zeros, desmos is your go-to. Type in that equation. And you can do one of two things, either type it in with the equal 0 or type it in without. It does not. This you want lowercase x's, otherwise I won't graph correctly. So if you do it without the 0, it's a quadratic, so it's gonna make a U shape. If you don't see both points, zoom out. So you could find them based on this, or you could put the equal 0. We're gonna give you the same things, except the equal 0 will just be 2 straight lines instead of your parabola. Either or, it doesn't matter. And then your zeros, solutions, roots would just be where does it cross the x-axis. And you're gonna write that in curly brackets. -7, -16 and 2.5. So when dealing with quadratics, make sure your solutions, your roots are in curly brackets. If it were just a line, or it just asks you to find the x-intercepts, one, it should tell you how to write it, but then those would just be in order of this. Remember something. That one can be done by hand by factoring. Did you want to see that done? So that one you can type in as is, or you could, we'll come back to that one. Or C. Let's see, which one? Oh, on the. Got it. Let's do number 6 on the same page, and then we'll do that one. But number 6 on this page, and then for C. So if I wanted to do this as is, I'm going to type this in. Because it doesn't equal 0, it's still gonna give me my two solutions. If you were wanting to factor it, you would have to make it equal to 0. But those are still gonna be good. -5 and not gonna solve this all the way, but if you wanted to solve it by factoring or to set it to 0, you would subtract both sides by 5. And then you can put that in, or you can factor it. Either way, you would get the same. Let's do 4C, number 16. So anytime you see literal equations where it gives you a bunch of different variables, you're solving that by hand. Solve it like a regular equation, but solve it for whatever the missing variable is. So in this case, we're solving for B. You gotta get everything else away from it. How could we do that? How could we get rid of the 1/2 of the 8? We cannot do this one. Divide by. So instead of dividing by 1/2, let's flip it and multiply both sides by 2. And then divide both sides by 2. Literal equations cannot be done in desmos, so you have to know how to solve. I'll make that our stopping point. You are more than welcome to keep going in this packet. Your J labs are going to be due next Thursday, so make sure if you have not been working on them that you get them done. Remember that your test nav, the last 7 problems are due on Monday. Keep working in your 8-ball packet. I'm gonna collect those on Thursday also. And that can either be problem if you have done, or if you do more and get those checked. But it'll be an average of all of those scores as one sum and difference. So make sure you're working on that. Not for homework, but if you want homework. Come see me after school today if you need help on Delta Math or any SOL practice. You guys have 2 Delta Maths that are due tomorrow. So you can either use this time to keep working, or you can put your iPads and calculators up.